Hi, my name is Cordula Hansen. I am one of the co-founders of XYZ Technical Art Services GmbH. We are a studio based in Germany working in digital arts, especially in 3D and immersive methodologies for storytelling in film and education. During the RETOLD project, we were working as part of Newer Digital Limited, who are one of the project partners responsible for developing a digital solution for documentation and presentation of data, specifically tailored to archaeological and ethnographic open-air museums. In this presentation, I will talk about how we used our experience in creative technologies and design to help reconcile the advanced technical aspects of digital preservation and documentation with the highly variable and diverse organizational challenges that open-air museums are facing. Open-air museums as organizations are very diverse in size, history, and funding levels. The RETOLD project focused on creating best practices in documentation needed to make sure that these methods and solutions were accessible and easy to implement. What did we propose? As those of you who work at or have visited open-air museums already know, these museums are different from more collection-based museums. Instead of interpreting collections of objects by investigating them and presenting them to visitors, open-air museums are providing an experience to visitors within a material environment. Not only do these museums contain buildings, whether reconstructed or reimagined, but they also host researchers and craftspeople who, as guides or as living history displays, illustrate aspects of life in the past in the museum. The RETOLD project, funded by the Creative Europe scheme, proposed to help museums meet the challenges and opportunities of digitization by creating best practices for collecting, digitizing, and publishing open access data in a replicable and scalable way. Secondly, the project wanted to harness the power of digital media to create more informative visual documentation materials that took into account the spatial aspects of museum inventories. We also proposed digital media as a way to help open-air museums communicate the knowledge they create in their everyday activities to diverse and potentially new audiences. During the project, we were cognizant of the potential synergies between open-air museums and the creative industries, where digital storytelling skill sets are well represented. For example, photography, filmmaking, audio recording, computer graphics, immersive media and design thinking approaches and iterative workflows are commonplace in the digital arts. Since social media have accelerated the need for and presence of media skills in most workplaces, we were able to take this as a starting point and explore more advanced techniques and their applications together with the open-air museums. In collaboration with the museum partners and EXARC, we contributed first the design of data collection forms for the knowledge specific to open-air museums. This was a building documentation form conceptualized and tested by Museums Dorf Düppel and Astra, and a data form that would accompany an audiovisual capture of craft activities. Second, a user-centric design for a tool to capture this data straight to digital, to avoid doubling the work of capturing and then digitizing, and to facilitate dissemination through online media. Third, activities to make audiovisual and 3D visualizations more accessible to the museum partners, such as training and workflow templates. Before deciding how we would approach the design of a data capture tool, we needed to know more about our potential users, open-air museum staff and volunteers. As is common in software development, we planned a phase of user research as part of the user experience design process. To learn about both the museum's needs and the potential challenges to using and integrating digital media into their everyday work, we conducted exploratory interviews and analysis to identify the main issues museums had with documentation and use of digital tools. We sent and analyzed a survey capturing the current state of digitization and use of digital tools in open-air museums, analyzed currently available digital documentation and archiving tools, created research-based user personas, mapped user journeys and task flows, created a wireframe prototype and tested the concept prototype and gathered feedback on usability from museum users. At the start of the project, we already knew that we needed to develop some form of digital application that would bring together the work done by Museums Dorf Düppel and Astra in designing data entry forms, and add value by including multimedia files such as videos of craft activities and 3D models of buildings. The main idea in user experience design is that products or technology will be more acceptable and useful when users do not have to struggle to understand the product. Before building the product, time is spent on getting to know the prospective user, how they work, how the product would fit into their environment and daily habits, what their goals and motivations are, and what challenges the product needs to solve. As a project consortium, we also had our own requirements. We were aware of the need for data interoperability and standardization of documentation, but we knew that creating a user-friendly methodology meant that it needed to be understandable, learnable, and appropriate to the organizational skill sets and knowledge base of the museums. But we needed a deeper understanding of their specific challenges in documenting and digitizing their inventories and what their expectations were of a digital tool. From our interview participants, we learned that documentation of buildings and office-based tasks such as maintaining records and digitizing archival material often suffer from discontinuous attention, perhaps due to lack of staff and funding. As we got to know our partner museums, we learned that a structured approach to documentation that was suitable for smaller open-air museums was almost entirely missing. During the research phase, we surveyed a number of platforms that facilitate uploading of museums material. We also took a look at 3D capture technologies currently in use in the cultural heritage sector. In both cases, there was a high emphasis on data integrity and rigor. The digital platforms were metadata focused, securing integration into a consistent data model. A disadvantage from the perspective of a smaller museum was the need to either establish a maintenance infrastructure and staff expertise within the museum, or to delegate this to a service contractor. Both were resource intensive, and it was difficult for museums to assess whether the product would be appropriate for them through, say, a free trial. The best 3D capture methods were built on a similar ethos to preserve museum inventory and sites in as much detail as possible. For example, laser scanners and LiDAR were the most prominent and highest quality tools to use. With high quality, however, come issues of large file sizes, processing power, data storage, and usability of the files for, say, online hosting. For our museum partners, these approaches were highly desirable, but they were also met with skepticism as to their suitability due to the small size of museum organizations and their available resources. We also learned that, especially in open-air museums, there is a lot of emphasis on the physical and material experience of the space. Visitors are sometimes even encouraged to leave their digital devices behind and engage with the museum on an experiential basis. Often, the natural environment in which the museum is situated is presented as one of its attractions for visitors. It became clear that digital storytelling methods, such as virtual experiences, were of low priority to our museum partners. However, they acknowledged that a digital presence was absolutely necessary to reach visitors remotely, and that this presence should be enriched through materials showcasing the museum. In creating a digitization and documentation methodology specific to the needs of open-air museums, our main challenge was to preserve the rigor of good data management while at the same time lowering the barrier to entry for museums so that the concepts of digital preservation and documentation became more tangible and approachable. Considering the unique emphasis in open-air museums on inventory that is contextual and experimental, as well as intangible, such as craft activities and living history, we needed a way to make multimedia capture, such as video, audio, and 3D, understandable and affordable. Since time and money were cited in our initial conversations as the most frequent barrier to doing digital, we concluded that there was an actual need for a tool or methodology that made it easy for museum staff from different backgrounds to collect museum data. The tool should be able to save time through a standardized workflow and a straight-to-digital approach. We articulated the main roles and responsibilities within a typical open-air museum in Europe: curators, student volunteers or interns, craft and maintenance staff, and museum directors. This allowed us to determine who the actual main user of the tool was going to be. We summarized these insights into our primary persona, articulating their motivations, frustrations, and their goals and needs in their role. We then interviewed museum curators to learn more about their day-to-day documentation and digitization tasks and how they were approaching them currently, such as catching up on digitizing documentation from 10 years ago, carrying out annual documentation of an outdoor exhibit, preparing work packages for co-workers, preparing a social media campaign for an upcoming event, collecting material for a journal article, evaluating the quality of documentation and research data. We visualize these tasks in our user journeys. These are visual representations of the goal of our user's activity and the subtasks involved in reaching this goal. We then broke the user journeys into individual task flows to ideate features of the methodology and associated data collection tool. In parallel, our colleagues at Museumsdorf-Düppel and Astra in Sibiu were designing and testing the data collection forms for building and craft activities. Again, this was a delicate balance between different requirements, rigor and good research practice, relevance to open-air museums, and good structure and usability. So it was time to combine the results from our user research with the data forms and design a first draft for a digital data collection tool. Here we were able to propose the overall structure. The separation of documentation into buildings and crafts, a setup phase to input static information for buildings and crafts, a walk-around structure for recurring documentation and recording of observations on buildings. Here we use a 3D model to place observation marks, where we then add detailed descriptions and images. Usability testing of a very simple wireframe prototype and the build by UAB yielded positive responses from museum staff who were enthusiastic about the digital tool, but perhaps even more so about the structured approach to data collection. For us as creative technologists, the integration of 3D models as a way of mapping the data to the spatial reality of the objects documented and of video to capture processes over time was something we may have taken for granted. For test participants, the question how to procure the media files to upload to the application was a much bigger challenge. We needed a way to address this obstacle to fully utilize our proposed documentation method. We needed to solve a philosophical issue of accessibility and standards. Ideally, using audio, visual and 3D media in museum and research practice will conform to the highest academic research standards, using high-end equipment and thorough data management. In some of the smaller museums, however, use of any digital tools and collaborative workflows was relatively new to the organization. Using advanced computer graphics was a steep learning curve. It therefore did not make sense to prescribe a standard of best practices that would preclude museums from approaching digitization and visualization at all. For us, lowering the barrier for entry meant identifying why museums want to use digital and 3D media and finding the lowest cost, most user-friendly tools to achieve their goals. Giving hands-on workshops to introduce these capture technologies, making them visible and tangible. Creating sample workflows and templates for digitization and documentation, inspiring museum staff and volunteers to give momentum to digitization initiatives, evangelize the use of easily accessible and learnable tools to keep digitization sustainable, sharing the results in a community to help improve the work and keep motivation high. For example, we created a template for craft documentation videos to be accompanied by a digital craft documentation form for metadata capture. The template includes a script and shot description and a sample video with on-screen commentary. Together with the craft documentation form, it is the basis for capturing craft activities at museums and ensuring that they can be associated with metadata as part of a database later. We also conducted a series of workshops on photogrammetry in situ at the museums, introducing readily available quality capture tools that are currently free to use for small companies, such as Reality Capture. While a commercial product as part of the Epic Games ecosystem, Reality Capture has a tradition in the field of cultural heritage, as well as game development and film, with lots of training available. We propose that especially for open-air museums, there are now a lot of opportunities to get started with digitization and digital media, between ever more accessible graphics applications and the structured approach to documentation developed during the RETOLD project. If you would like to learn more about our process, NUA present a case study of the RETOLD project, and you can get in touch with EXARC or myself about 3D and digital media training. Thank you very much.